In 1920 and 1921, Ireland was in a dark place. The events of Bloody Sunday on the week before Kilmichael Ambush, together with a hard and sustained campaign by the British Crown forces on Irish civilians, fuelled the Irish volunteers to retaliate with calculated force. West Cork was the epicentre of a guerrilla war, and an event in Kilmichael on November the 28th, 1920 would prove to have a monumental impact on the Irish War of Independence. As a local historian, I have always had a keen interest in the story of the Kilmichael Ambush. 100 years later, it is more important than ever that we commemorate this event. An event that would send shockwaves across the Irish Sea to the British establishment. In this story, we take a fresh look at the Kilmichael Ambush, a story of a century.
He was the first man leading all the time.
All the time, yes. He was a brave man.
Brave man.
A great soldier.
Great soldier.
Great fighter.
I've no doubt my view was they were peace-loving men, but they were forced in to take the action they had to take.
Very few people knew where they were buried in case of reprisals from the Black and Tans. The people here lived, I believe, in fear of the Black and Tans for the reprisals.
And of course, as those coffins were being taken through Cork City, some of the locals were saying, send back the empties and we'll fill them again. So it was a terrible time.
General Tom Barry is probably the best known figure associated with Kilmichael Ambush. Barry, who was OC of the Flying Column, was an ex-British Army soldier who fought in what is now Iraq in the First World War. He came home to Ireland in 1919 and joined the IRA in the summer of 1920. Barry and other column leaders in the IRA provided much needed military expertise to lead relatively unequipped and inexperienced IRA local volunteers.
These boys were shaped by their own personal experience, their family experience, the local history and the national history. They just didn't appear overnight and decide we're going to shoot a number of auxiliaries. It was a slow process that made them arrive at the roadside of Kilmichael. So motivation would have been a very strong factor. The burden of leadership was very heavy because the success or failure of the operation, for the most part, depended on the training, the preparation undertaken by the leader. And in this case, the burden of leadership fell upon the shoulders of Tom Barry, who we must remember was in his early 20s.
Almost everybody of the auxiliary party in Kilmichael were war veterans. I think one wasn't actually an auxiliary. I think he was like a black and tan and a driver, although he mightn't be driving one of the vehicles. But basically, these were men who had not just been in the war or just been in the army, but almost without exception, they were men who had done so well in the war that they'd been promoted from the ranks. And you can tell that by the decorations they had. A lot of them had decorations like the military medal, which was only given to enlisted men. So they'd been through a lot. They clearly probably had a taste for action. They may be driven to some extent to join the auxiliaries out of economic necessity, but at the same time they were looking for a bit more action and so on, notwithstanding all that they had suffered and all that they had seen.
Tom Barry and his volunteers trained in a remote farm in Clogher, north of Dunmanway. After just a week's training, he moved the group to Eunan, north of Inchigeela.
Tom Barry and the column moved from the training camp in Clogher. They came way down south and they moved in here to prepare for the task ahead. And some of the men were local and they knew the area well, and they got in touch with Father O'Connell, who was PPing in his skiing, who rode out on horseback to hear their confessions at around midnight. And he tied the horse across the road here, and each one of them went across the road one by one. And when the last man went across, he came back with him and blessed them and wished them well. And he rode off into the darkness, and Tom Barry and the column moved at around 2 o'clock on their way to the ambush in Kilmichael.
A few days earlier, on Friday the 26th of November, Tom Barry and Michael McCarthy rode a reconnaissance on horseback to Glown and across the Kilmichael area, carefully observing the road system and the lie of the land. They selected this particular stretch of road, which was deemed to be suitable. It was a safe distance from a croom. The terrain was ideal, with little or no cover along the roadsides, rocky outcrops on each side, affording the attackers many advantages and leaving the attacked with little or no cover. It lay between 2 bends on the road and before possible diversion roads to Copeen.
In selecting the ambush site, he ticked the boxes, we'll say, in a number of key factors, military elements. Number one, he acted on reasonably sound intelligence in that he knew the mobile patrol of auxiliaries would pass that way on the day selected for the ambush. He selected what the military called the key terrain. The roadsides, the area that he selected would be what we would call good killing ground. He deployed his men very well. He deployed them to ensure overlapping fields of fire. In other words, the area selected would be well covered by rifle fire. But equally, he also deployed them very, very close to the road. He was acutely aware that his men didn't have the military training that the auxiliaries had. They weren't able to go to, a rifle range and conduct practice like the auxiliary had. They didn't have the experience, the military training. His men only had extremely little training, and in some cases only fired a few shots before the Kilmichael ambush. So where possible, he deployed them very close to the road. His philosophy, as he said later, there are no bad shots at 10 or 15 yards.
Tom Barry and his men left Auxiliaries around 2 a.m. in terrible weather conditions. They marched quietly past Canon, through Ballineen, pausing at a house in Lisicran for buckets of tea. They crossed a bog south of Copeen, washed the mud off themselves in a stream, and then crossed the Bantry line and onto Shanacashel and into the ambush site. Barry dispersed his charges thus. He stood at the command post. Hidden behind him were the experienced Jim Spud Murphy, John the Flyer Nyan, and Mick O'Herlihy. Close beside the command post, with a commanding viewpoint on a high rocky knob, were Section 1, consisting of 10 men. Section 2, another 10 men, were located around 150 yards further northwest on a rocky outcrop on the bend of the road. Michael McCarthy was in charge here. Michael McCarthy, Jack Lorden, Jack Hennessy and Tim Crowley operated an exposed position just a few feet from the roadside in a hollow in the rock they called the Hole. They built themselves a stone wall with firs stuck in between as camouflage in an effort to conceal themselves. Number 3 section was divided. Stephen O'Neill, along with 6 riflemen, occupied a chain of rock south of the road. Their main purpose was to make sure nobody could shelter on that side of the road. They were warned of the possible danger of crossfire from them hitting their comrades, so they had to be particularly careful. The remaining 6 riflemen of number 3 section were dispersed around 60 yards north of the road bend to cover the possibility that a third lorry might arrive. There were unarmed scouts positioned north of the ambuscade to signal the enemy approach. Also, there was one scout positioned south of the command post to watch the Dunmanway Road. There were 2 scouts positioned on a high vantage point on top of Hairmount Hill at a spot called the Batteries. These men had a view all the way back the road to Culderry and right up to the ambush site. When they spotted the lorries passing a particular point on the road, they were instructed, using a white sheet, to signal to a scout positioned just north of the ambuscade, thereby indicating to the ambushers the position of the approaching lorries.
He used numerical superiority. Based on the intelligence, he knew that the mobile patrol would consist of 2 auxiliaries, maybe 2 lorry loads of auxiliaries, 18 to 20 men. So he deployed over 30 men, giving his unit numerical superiority. Very important, he was able to deploy the element of surprise. This is a critical aspect to the success of any military operation, because when you hit your target, they basically have very little time to recover. They weren't expecting what's coming. So the element of surprise is critical, and Tom Barry was able to deploy that.
Barry and his men arrived in Kilmichael at 8 a.m. in the morning. It would be 8 hours before the ambush would take place. They endured harsh weather conditions. They were wet, cold and hungry. At around 4:15 p.m, a signal warned of approaching lorries. Just then, a sidecar and grey horse with 5 armed IRA men came from the Macroom direction, and they were urgently directed to gallop up the nearby lane out of sight. Just seconds later, the first lorry came along, followed by a second some distance behind. It is said that the lorry occupants were singing as they approached the ambuscade. The first Crosley tender drove past, just yards from the men of Section 2, on towards the command post. Tom Barry stood in the centre of the road, wearing a military uniform. The lorry slowed down as it approached Barry. Barry said that he threw a grenade, a Mills-bomb, into the open-top cab of the lorry, and the truck rolled forward and stopped. Section 1 then opened fire from their high vantage point nearby. The auxiliaries had no chance. In all probability, they were wiped out in minutes.
He backed the lorry along the road.
Up towards Macroom.
Yes, he backed the lorry, but there's a wind in the road.
There is, yes.
We road like that. He backed the lorry, and instead of taking the turn, he backed it into the dike.
Into the dike.
Yeah.
Now, he jumped out and he ran across the bog then and tried to escape. I see. The men then that jumped out, the auxiliaries who jumped out on the road, they laid down on the road.
They did. Any of them that were able to lay down and were able to fire.
Well, the second lorry came on immediately and stopped all right now where the monument is at the hole.
Yes.
And they came out. I saw them coming out of the lorry and I fired.
Yes.
And they came out and they lay down on the road and they fought until the last man.
Yes. Did the driver of the lorry then try to back?
The driver of the lorry then backed. And I saw him backing. And I saw him getting out of the lorry. And I got up my position. And I ran after him. And on far, he had a road and I had the rough ground. I went after him, and when I went after him, I got up to him just at Murray's. He was just gone over the ditch at Murray's house. Not, is it Murray? Kelly's house, I think it's
Kelly's house.
I think
yes.
it's Kelly's.
Yes.
You'll have to excuse me.
Yes.
I fired at him 2 or 3 shots, and I saw him falling.
Yeah.
I came out again, and I fixed Barry told us before we went into the fight that it was a fight to a finish.
Yes.
And if we were to fight it to a finish, we were to fix bayonets.
Yes.
And come out on the road and fight them.
Yes.
I put on the bayonet on the rifle and came down the road, and there was a tan under the lorry, and he's facing me up and facing down, firing down.
Yes.
I came behind him, and if I went down any further, probably he could have me shot, or I could have, before I saw him, he was lying down in a crouch position. I fired at him, and I told him put his hands up. He came out from under the lorry, and he says, "What am I going to do?" I says, "Go down the road, and they'll tell you what they're going to do with you."
And did he lift down his arms?
He lifted down his arms and lifted there. He went down the road, and he didn't go too far when he was.
I shot him.
After the first phase, Barry, with Murphy, Nyhan and Herlihy, cautiously made their way back along the road to assist their comrades, who were exchanging fire with the occupants of the second lorry.
Now, you would say that McCarthy was then shot by one of them from the road, one of the auxiliaries from the road, and the same went home for Jim O Sullivan.
Because they continued, no matter how we tried, they were able to continue
firing,
because like now you were laying there, and McCarthy and a section are there, and there were at that time there was a little dyke on the road, dyke, and they were laying in that little dyke, and even though it'd be hard to pick a man laying down like that.
I know, yes, I see.
Because of Barry's careful planning, the auxiliaries had practically nowhere to take cover. Nevertheless, a savage exchange of fire occurred between the two groups. When Barry and his 3 riflemen of Section 1 returned and reinforced those fighting the second lorry, it didn't take them long to overpower and kill all of the auxiliaries. As one of the participants said, the fight had been short, sharp and very bloody. However, 3 of the rebels were shot. Jim O Sullivan, 23 years, from Knockavodra, Rossmore, was dead. Michael McCarthy, 23 years, from East Green, Dunmanway, was seriously wounded, or maybe dead. Jack Hennessy, who was beside McCarthy, stated afterwards, and I quote, "I was exchanging the auxiliaries on the road. I was wearing a tin hat, the helmet. I had fired about 10 rounds and got 5 bullets through the hat when the 6th bullet wounded me in the scalp. Vice Commandant McCarthy had got a bullet through the head and lay dead. I continued to load and fire, but the blood dripping from my forehead fouled the breech of my rifle. I dropped my rifle and took up McCarthy's." Now this gives us some idea of how vicious and savage the fighting was. Young Pat Deasy, just 16 years, from Kilmichael Bandon, was critically wounded. Pat had been positioned further back on the rocks, probably quite exposed there as well. On the following day, the 29th of November, several local houses, including Kelly's and O'Donoghue's, were burned by the auxiliaries in retaliation. One innocent man, Dinny O'Sullivan, came by horse and cart to Cronin's bar and shop in Coolderrihy for provisions. The auxiliaries raided the place. They weren't satisfied with his explanation, so they took him outside and shot him dead. Most men fled from their homes in the general Kilmichael area. The local school, Drumlee, was closed and did not reopen until December the 13th. The discussion around Kilmichael Ambush has become very polarised over the last 100 years. On the one hand, we have those who take every word Tom Barry wrote and said about Kilmichael as being absolutely correct and factual. But on the other hand, we have those who question and challenge Barry's accounts. To complicate matters, different participants in the ambush give differing versions of events.
In fact, there's always been more than one version of events. Like there's different IRA veterans have said it happened differently to the way that Tom Berry had described it in his memoir, Guerrilla Days in Ireland, which was published in the 1940s. And his account undoubtedly became the most famous account, but it was never the only one. And so there was a particularly nasty dispute between himself and Liam Deasy, whose younger brother was killed at the ambush, and who had been the OC of the West Cork Brigade during the War of Independence, over what had happened, because I guess a lot of people felt that Tom Berry's memoir, even though it was a really good read, had actually not taken enough account of other people's contribution. And so that when Liam Deasy wrote an account of the West Cork Brigade during the War of Independence that was published in the early 1970s, Towards Ireland Free, not only did it, gave accounts that varied from Tom Berry's, on a number of grounds, and particularly Kilmichael and Tom Berry launched this an attack on Liam Deasy and everyone who'd been involved. And then a group of IRA veterans published a letter disassociating themselves from Tom Berry's attacks, if you like, and confirming Liam Deasy's account. And this caused a lot of trouble. This was in 1974, 75.
Further controversy would surface years later, when a book by Peter Hart, a Canadian historian who completed his PhD in Trinity College, raised some further questions about the ambush. Peter would come across veteran interviews by one Fr Chisholm.
And he had come across interviews done by a man named Father John Chisholm, who had basically helped Liam Deasy write his account. And Peter Hart quoted these interviews anonymously, as well as a couple that he did himself, to argue that there was, in fact, been no false surrender, which Tom Berry had said in his memoir had been the reason that all the auxiliaries had been put to death.
Looking at the ambush from a purely military perspective, okay, I really don't think the whole issue of the false surrender matters much. People must realize it's very easy to debate this and say this could have happened, this should have happened, this shouldn't have happened. This was a war. There is no easy way of killing fellow human beings in wartime. There is an old military saying that goes, no plan survives first contact. When the shooting starts, soldiers have two things in mind. One, kill the enemy, and two, stay alive.
The British authorities claimed that the auxiliaries were hacked about the head with axes. This was stringently refuted by Tom Berry.
And it's very hard to see at Kilmichael, given that the condition that the auxiliaries were in. I think in some cases, Jack O Sullivan gives an account of being told by Barry to finish the fellow off, but the good man was in agony and dying. So what were you to do? So I think some of the accusations of sort of savage ruthlessness are almost beside the point. Where a man, how else? What were you to do? There was no hospitals. There was no way of saving them. And in some cases, it may have been a mercy to kill people. 16
auxiliaries died during the ambush. One, the driver of the second truck, Cecil Gottfried, escaped.
There's been a church on this site since at least 1500. It is the burial place of the Auxiliaries of Eveleary. The chieftain is here. It's a place with chapters of history. And we're standing by the graveside of Cecil Gottfried, who was killed at Kilmichael Ambush. Cecil Gottfried was from Fife in Scotland, and he had joined the British Army when he was only 16, and he served in Afghanistan in the Royal Flying Corps, which is the RAF today, and he was one of their youngest instructors. in Afghanistan. And he and his wife, she was a military nurse, and they were both stationed at Macroom Castle with the auxiliary group in November 1920. On the day of Kilmichael Ambush, the 28th of November 1920, Cecil Gottfried was injured but managed to escape. He was one of 18 auxiliary soldiers, but he managed to escape the ambush and make his way back to Macroom. But at Drumcarra, he was intercepted by the local branch of the Kilmichael IRA. They arrested him. His gun had no ammunition, and he was unable to defend himself, and they decided that there and then he should be executed because their lives would be in danger. If he'd got back to Macroom, he would have recognised them. They stood in danger. So he was buried in Nanahala Bog, where Kilmichael football pitch is today. Sometimes they call it Guthrie Park. But anyhow, he was buried there until 1926. And with information that was given, the body was finally brought to Inchigeela and buried here. And this is probably a military stone that stands over his burial place here.
A second auxiliary, Frederick Henry Ford, was seriously injured and left for dead. However, Ford would end up surviving the ambush.
First of all, sort of the funny thing is that he survived probably because he was so badly injured that everybody thought he was dead. He'd been shot in the head during the fight with Section 2 of the IRA and just lay on the road. Certainly the IRA took no notice of the body, really, just left it there. And so he lay there all night, pretty well at death's door. He was found next morning and somebody noticed a faint sign of life. So he was sort of rushed back to Macroom and then to hospital in Cork. And in fact, 2 weeks later, there was a photograph of him sitting up in bed with a big bandage around his head in a hospital in Cork. So by that stage, he obviously recovered consciousness. But certainly he was at death's door at the actual ambush site.
The day after the ambush, an auxiliary engineer named Fleming came to Kilmichael to assess and document the ambush site and chart the facts as they lay before him. He created a map of the site and with some accuracy marked out the positions of the fallen auxiliaries. He also worked out the positions of the rebel attackers from the imprints and impressions left on the heather and growth.
Ford had got some compensation through the courts after Kilmichael. And he did this and he had engaged his family had rather engaged a solicitor from Macroom named Tom Granger to act on his behalf. Granger successfully handled the case and Ford was awarded £10,000 compensation. And then all the details of the case were filed away in Granger's office, including the Fleming map that he actually used to support Ford's case. 40 years later, the map was found when they were clearing out the offices in about 1960, and it found its way to the O'Mahony family in Ballineen. Now, there's an interesting sort of corollary to that, is that about 4 years later, there was a visitor to the O'Mahonys, so they got the map out to show him. And they had quite an evening of sort of studying the map and the visitor explaining in great detail some of the aspects of the ambush. And the reason, of course, he was able to do that was because the visitor was none other than Tom Barry.
Like the military or the police would be very good at documenting evidence of what they would consider to be an incident or an outrage or a crime or whatever you want to call it. And like I said, the map itself, I think, was fairly accurate. And the reason I believe that is because it's substantiated by other evidence. For example, the evidence in Dr. Kelleher's autopsy that the evidence that he gave at the inquest after the ambush mentioned certain wounds, we'll say up around the auxiliaries in number 2 section. And again, that's substantiated by evidence given by Jack Hennessy in relation to the action himself and John Lauren took, that he mentioned a Bureau of Military History.
As a consequence of the Kilmichael Ambush, 3 IRA volunteers lost their lives. Jim O Sullivan from Knockavather, Rossmore, Michael McCarthy, East Green, Dunmanway, and Pat Deasy, Kilmacsimon Key. Volunteer Tim O'Connell was appointed to oversee the safe removal of the dead and dying from the scene. A horse and cart was borrowed from O'Donoghue's to ferry the dead men away, while a door was borrowed from nearby Kelly's farmhouse, on which young Pat Deasy was carried away from the site.
This is the Baltimore Household. Neelis Baltimore and his wife lived here. Neelis was my grandfather. My mother was born here, and 4 of her sisters and her brother, my Uncle Tim. Back in 1920, the ambush, the men that were injured were brought here. Pat Deasy was brought to the house because he was in a very critical state. And the 2 lads that died, Michael McCarthy and Jim O Sullivan, died in the car house. Died on the way up, and they were laid out in the car house for a while. Pat Deasy was by the fireside. My grandmother was heavily pregnant at the time with one of my aunts, and she cared for him until unfortunately he passed away about 10 o'clock that night. At that stage, they had sent for a priest and a doctor. The doctor was in Johnstown, the priest was in Coolderry. Dr. Neuhan was his name, and unfortunately it was no good for Pat Deasy. He had passed on, and Father Gould was the man that came to give him their last rites. When all that was done, there was 2 men sent for carpenters who made up makeshift coffins. In the meantime, my grandfather, Neelis Baltimore, and 1 or 2 of his helpers carried the bodies down to the bog, Gurtrow bog, just below here. And they were there for couple of nights, and then I think very few people knew where they were buried in case of reprisals from the Black and Tans. The people here lived, I believe, in fear of the Black and Tans for the reprisals. Johnstown is only probably a mile cross country, but there was, even though it's a remote spot, it probably could still be found if the Black and Tans wanted to find it.
On Wednesday night, under cover of darkness, under the direction of Jim Crowley, captain of Untitled Company, the bodies were removed from Gurtrow bog, and they were carried to a dense furze brake in Howrahans of Corradrina.
Yeah, well, Casey's have been 5 generations undertakers in Inchigeela, and they were approached, I suppose, to provide the coffins for the Kilmichael dead, and it was difficult for them to provide them for the IRA because they were, all the undertakers were to keep records, and they were subject to inspection, so that had to be done very privately, and they said they were behind a curtain when they were being made, and that the coffins were collected in the middle of the night in a horse and cart, and rather than going through the village and over the bridge, they came up this way, past where we are standing here. Within feet of us there was the old road, an old right of way crossing the River Lee, which is only yards away from us, and the wheels of the cart were muffled with bran bags and stuff like that to keep it quiet passing through, and it went up over a funeral path through the townland of Carrignacurra and possibly onto the Dunmanway Road, but they eventually came to the home of the Coakley family in Derlee. And I knew some of the children, and Teddy was a young lad at the time, and he asked his mother when he saw the coffins in the kitchen, what were they? And she said they were wardrobes, because, you know, if the army came in, the child wouldn't give the game away. So from Derlee then they were taken to take the bodies to Kinneigh for their burial.
Father O'Connell came from Inniskeen here to Castletown, and he gave these 3 men a Christian burial under the cover of darkness. This is the same man who came to Auxiliaries before the boys left for Kilmichael and heard their confessions. When Jeremiah O'Mahony died in early March 1922, he was buried beside his comrades, and again Father O'Connell attended. Each year Kilmichael Ambush is commemorated, beginning with a Mass Auxiliaries here in Castletownkinneigh. Prayers are said at the graves of Jack O Sullivan, McCarthy and their comrade Diarmid O'Mahony, who died tragically some months later.
As a young fella, this used to be a huge day in our lives, living in the pub. It used to be a huge day at Kilmichael Ambush Sunday. Yes. The earliest memory I have was as an altar boy, and when the firing party used to fire the shots, there used to be a desperate scramble for the casings. There used to be a right souvenir back in the 60s. And the firing party were there in for another couple of years. Then unfortunately they passed away. I think mid-70s was the last firing party because the men were getting old of the men themselves, the flying column in.
Some of the older fellas in the bar would have remembered the Kilmichael Ambush. I had Timmy Cotter from Gorton. He said he can remember seeing the lorries on fire at the ambush site, and John Patrick Cotter from Drumnagoppel was another character that remembered the black and tans and remembered the story at Kilmichael. And near us here there was a man living, John Reardon, and he was then living in Gortnalower, which is only about 2.5 miles from the ambush, and he was at the site the morning after the 29th of November, and he saw the bodies on the roadside, and he said the watches and things that could be stolen off them were still there, and shortly as they arrived, the trucks came to collect the body.
Today in Ireland we live in a wonderful country, enjoying a hard-won freedom of democracy. It's easy to become complacent and forget about where that democracy came from. 100 years on, we must remember the ordinary men and women who did extraordinary things, led by the steely, fearless military genius, Tom Barry. Barry won the respect of his men who were ready to die for him. On this monument are etched the words, forever in their memory, they shall be spoken among their people, the generations shall remember them and call them blessed.
Cuoinecán céad bliain Kilviheel, is mór an ár agus pribléad dom bheith an láthair staróil Kilviheel, bliain an aig bliana chun a más a thuairt agus padar rá son anamnacha an tróir léach a maraíag san lécán. Bemid buig go deo das na fir an ára crága rhod an aig na Auxiliaries taobh hir de caragracha Kilviheel san glawn fréic fián in íothar Corcaí, agus a bhrisise ora don céad ó riamh in éireann. Sa bhliain seo déan fimid ceiliúra na fir agus maná a bhain saoirse amach, le fuil, alles, deora agus ibertí. Sinne a ólan an tuisce in ní mór dóin cíanamh bócalaí Kilviheel, a hocail an tobar sa lawn gúlta céad bhliain á hin, go néana dia trócra ortha go léir.
Song and in story, the memory of Pierce and MacBride, whose names are illumined in glory, with martyrs who long since have died. Forget not the boys of Kilmichael, who feared not the might of the foe, the day that they marched into battle, they laid all the black and tans low. So here's to the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought 'neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white and blue. On the 20th day of November, the Tans left the town of Macrone, They were seated in two crossley tenders, which led them right into their doom. They set out on the road to Kilmichael and never expected to stall, till they were met by the boys of the column, who made a clean sweep of them all. So here's to the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought 'neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white and blue. The sun in the west it was sinking, 'twas the eve of a cold winter's day, when the towns we were eagerly awaiting sailed into the spot where we lay. And over the hills went the echo, the peal of the rifle and gun, and the flames from their lorries gave tidings that the boys of the column had won. So here's to the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought 'neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white and blue. The lorries were ours before twilight, and high over Dunmanway town our banners and triumph were waving, to show that the towns had gone down. We gathered our rifles and bayonets, and soon left that land so obscure, and we never drew rein till we halted at the faraway camp of Granure. So here's to the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought 'neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white and blue. So here's to the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought 'neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white and blue.